I'd like to start by just, what I want to do mostly is talk about interprofessional teamwork and also interprofessional education in healthcare, because these are the journeys that we all are on, and you all also. But I want to try to put it in a context of the changes that are occurring in healthcare. And so I wanted to start by just asking, because I think it's worth to remind ourselves who is in this room, who we are. So if you think back to high school, where did you fit in your high school class? Near the bottom? In the middle? Near the top? You're probably going to be pretty near the top of your class. Who could the teachers count on? Or the priest at church, or whatever else? Who could people count on if they had something that needed to be done, or a project, or something? It was all of you in this room. Who would come in early? Who would stay late? Who would get the project done? Society does not give the privilege of caring for its ill just to anyone. You earn that privilege, you earn it every day, and society picks the very best among us to be in healthcare. That's not to say that there aren't really good people in other professions as well, but across the board, if you're a nurse, if you're a pharmacist, if you're a social worker, if you're a physician, you are among the finest that our society has. And I want you to keep that in mind, because I'm going to ask you some questions next about how our healthcare system is doing. And I'm not thinking right now about Obamacare or whether you're Republican or Democrat or anything. I'm stepping back just a little bit farther, and I just want to look at healthcare not only in the United States, but in any country across the world where healthcare is practiced in the way that we practice it. But I'd like to think first about the United States, and I want to ask a question. If anybody knows what percent of our gross domestic product in the United States is devoted to healthcare every year? 17? Very good. That's right, just a little over 17%. Excellent. Does anybody know what percent of our GDP was devoted to healthcare in the 1960s? 10. 5%, 1965. So if you look at the growth of healthcare spending, it's kind of an exponential curve. It tracks upward. Now we just got a little news that they said a little moderation of this just this year, but we've had those little reports at different points in this history, and at each time, a few years later, the trajectory is just right back up steeply. What's the right number? What's the right percent of GDP that we should spend on healthcare? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But at some point, we also have to build roads and defend a country and provide schools and whatever else. And so what we do know is that healthcare is reaching limits of what we can devote in terms of resources, whether it's at a level of a country, or the level of a state, or the level of a business, or the level of a family, or the level of an individual. At some point, there's more that we need to do, and the more that we spend on healthcare, it keeps us from doing those things. So we're probably reaching those limits. Now, if you look at the rate of that growth, do you know when that increase started to take place in the percent of our GDP that was devoted to healthcare?
In the 1960s?
It kind of started about World War II. And it's kind of gone like this. Now, if you go to other countries, we're the highest amount of any country, but the rate of growth is actually very uniform across countries. Everyone is experiencing the same uptick that is growing at unsustainable rates. So it's actually a global challenge, the challenge of cost. So cost. Quality. Has anybody read a report was from 1999 or 2000, right around that period of time. It had an interesting name. It was about medical error. Does anybody know the name of that? I see a yes. The Quality Chasm came next. That came a few years later. That was just prior to that. It was, does anybody know the name of it? It's by the same people, the Institute of Medicine, to Err is Human. So this report was like startling to people when it came out because it said, you know what, despite all these really good people working really hard, people are dying in our healthcare system potentially preventably. Does anybody know how many people that report said die of potentially preventable mistakes, complications, errors in healthcare in hospitals every year in the United States?
98,000.
Yeah, 44,000 to 98,000 people. That makes it roughly the 5th leading cause of death. When that report came out, they don't talk about this much anymore, but it's like basically loading up 2 747s and crashing them, 2 a week. I mean, it's a startling number. Does anybody know the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare? Have you all studied about the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare? That actually shows pictures of the rates of different procedures in different regions around the country. Certain things like having your hip broken and repaired, pretty much uniform across the country. Other things like whether you have a mastectomy or a lumpectomy for breast cancer, whether you have prostate surgery or radiation or just watching, whether you have a coronary artery bypass surgery, stents, and so forth. Wildly different rates across the United States with no apparent match to the disease base in those areas. Up to 3 and 4 and 10-fold differences, and up to 10-fold differences in cost or more between certain areas of the country and other areas of the country. So you have all these wonderful people, us, trained really well for years, working really hard, and yet very uneven quality, and quality not at the levels that we wish that it would be. Nobody wants to have 98,000 people dying a year that we could have potentially prevented. Do you know what those things are that we die from? Can anybody name something, a potentially preventable mistake or error that you could die from?
Medication.
I'm sorry?
Medication.
Medication error? Infection after surgery, central line infection, preventable blood clot, misfiled lab report. There's a list of about 17 different things, and when I teach fourth-year medical students, I show them that list. Except for wrong site surgery, every one of them has seen everything that is on this list. It is normal for them to these things that happen are potentially preventable. Does anybody know the work of Peter Pronovost and colleagues in Michigan, the Keystone Initiative about central line infections? Anybody know that? Do you know your rate of central line infections in your ICUs here at your hospital? So do you know the 5 things that you're supposed to do to reduce and prevent those central line infections? When I was a student, what we were taught about central line infections was what? So teach me. Alex, I had dinner with you last night. You have any idea, have you been taught anything about central line infections yet? You can just say no, and I'll pass over you. So what I was taught was, if somebody has a fever and they've got a line in place, think about the line as a possible cause for the fever. It's probably going to be some sort of organism, often staph or strep. You need to take the line out, you need to culture the tip, you need to do blood cultures, and you need to treat the patient with antibiotics. That's what I was taught about central line infections. I was not taught, hey, guess what? That patient didn't have a central line infection when they came in. Somehow, something we did gave that patient that central line infection, and if we use chlorhexidine, and if we use full barrier drapes, and if we don't use femoral sites, and if we work on taking lines out every day, we can pretty much eliminate these central line infections. Peter Pronovost got 105 intensive care units across the state of Michigan to collaborate together to try to do these 5 things that the CDC said would prevent those infections. And they essentially eliminated central line infections across the state of Michigan. It's published in 2006 in the New England Journal of Medicine. A savings of millions of dollars and many, many lives. from something that we sort of like took for granted without kind of like stepping back and going like, whoa, maybe this doesn't even need to happen. So cost, quality, and safety. How about uninsurance? You all live in Texas, so anybody here that you care for uninsured? Absolutely. Anybody care for an uninsured patient today? You know, absolutely. How many Americans at this moment in time are presently uninsured? What's the population of the United States? Roughly 300 plus million. How many uninsured? Somewhere around 50 million uninsured. The number is kind of tipping somewhere 45 to 55, somewhere in there. We care for them, but what does studies show if you don't have health insurance? And it's not only the health insurance, because we know about the social determinants of health, that that's really more maybe a marker even than a cause. But we know that we wait, we don't go in, we don't get care that we need. When we do get it, it's far into the condition that could have been maybe prevented or treated so much easier earlier. Anybody here uninsured? Anybody have a family member uninsured? I have 2 sons presently uninsured. Maybe we'll get better over the next few years as the health reform laws come into place. Still very challenging, because how that's all going to play out is something on the scale we've never attempted in this country. Unique to the United States, these challenges? No. Quality challenges are global. Access challenges are global. If you are in Canada or in England, your access challenge takes a different form of a waiting line or a queue or other things, but these challenges are global. And finally, cost, quality, access, experience of care. What does it feel like to give or receive care today in our healthcare system? So any of you go home at the end of the day, I hope you do, going like, this was the most amazing human experience that I could possibly have had. There was somebody who needed care. I was able to give it to them. It was extraordinary. Hopefully we've all had those days. Has anybody had a day when you go home exhausted, discouraged, depleted, frustrated, angry, mad, sad? Why did I ever think this was a good idea to be a doctor?
Yeah.
Or you're a nurse and you used to care for 1 critically ill patient, and then 5 years ago you cared for 2, and now you're caring for 3, even sicker with fewer help, less help. Or you're a family member and you feel scared to leave your loved one in the hospital, or the room is dirty, or who knows what. So this thing that should be the most precious of human exchanges so often is not that for us. And so this is the paradox that we're really talking about today. Really wonderful people with extraordinary resources, working as hard and as well as they know how, and yet costs high and increasing at unsustainable rates, quality uneven and not at the levels that we wish, people who cannot gain access to the care that they want, and often that care leaving people feeling empty and sad rather than fulfilled and whole. And so the question is, why? So that's really kind of what I've devoted my last 12 or 15 years to trying to understand. And it's very interesting. We talk about modern scientific medical practice. And we have fancy buildings and amazing equipment and all sorts of technologies. And yet, it's interesting to ask about the organizing structures and approaches that we use in healthcare today. Where did they come from? When were they born? Turns out healthcare has a birth date. Does anybody know what it is?
3000 BC.
Yes, sort of, in the deepest sense of what we're doing, but modern scientific medical practice, the thing that you're training and preparing to do, or doing for those of you who are faculty, those of us who are faculty, It actually came together. It has hundreds of years of antecedents, but it came together at a year and a place by a group of, in medicine, by a group of 4 people, at about the same time in nursing by a different pathway. But the place was Johns Hopkins, and the time was 1893 when the Johns Hopkins Medical School was first founded. That's a whole interesting story in and of itself, which I won't have time to go into, but you should read about the backstory of the founding of Johns Hopkins Medical School. They ran short of money, and so for 4 years they had initial faculty hired, but they couldn't open the medical school yet. And so these faculty had very interesting names. There were 4 of them. Dr. Welch was the dean. He was a pathologist. You may not have heard of him, but you've probably heard of the other 3. Dr. Osler. Anyone heard of William Osler?
Yeah.
Of course we have. Dr. Halsted, the surgeon. Anyone heard of Halstedian technique and so forth? And have you ever asked for a Kelly clamp? Dr. Kelly, the obstetrician gynecologist. They all were characters. But they represented the finest of these traditions, and they came together and they developed the models of practice and education that we use today. And even so, those were not widely utilized, and the state of medical education and medical practice across our country and across the world was very uneven. And there was a report that analyzed that and made some scathing comments and some recommendations, published in 1910. Does anybody know the name of that report? Flexner Report. And the world was ready and everything crystallized. Half of the institutions closed, and within a very short period of time, any place that you went, people were standardizing around this new and modern way of working. My grandfather began his practice of internal medicine in my home community of Wichita, Kansas in 1921. So right at the cusp of this change. And if you were able to go back in time and take my grandfather from 1921 and bring him today and bring him into your new beautiful hospitals, at first he would be pretty overwhelmed by all the technology and all the advances, but he was a very smart man. And he would look beneath the surface and he would immediately start to get comfortable. He would say, yes, it is held on. It is the thing that we had dreamed about, that I've just trained in, that I've just mastered. We're still doing it. He said, could I see a chart? Now, I don't know whether you have a chart that you could show him or if you need to sit him down in front of a computer or maybe a little bit of both. But it would have an organization to it. Chief complaint, history of present illness, social history, family history, review of systems, physical exam. So he would say, so the doctor sees the patient, talks with the patient, examines the patient, writes a note, writes some orders. The nurse comes, takes the orders off, helps the patient in these ways. I get it. And if you need additional help, you'll ask for a consultation and that person will come and they will see the patient and write. And yes, exactly. That was our breakthrough. Now, how about the organization of your system? Do you have departments? Do you have Department of Medicine? Do you have Department of Surgery, Department of Pediatrics? And is nursing part of hospital administration and the medical staff holds itself separate? And yes, thank goodness, this is wonderful. One of my most treasured possessions is my grandfather's medical bag. It's a beautiful bag. It's great big. It's worn smooth. One handle's broken. Another's clearly been replaced at some point in the past. You open it up, it has this interesting odor that comes out of it. You kind of want to smell it, but then you kind of don't. But he could put everything in that bag that he could do for his patient, and he did. And he would carry that to the bedroom, to the kitchen, to his office, to the hospital. We don't carry bags anymore. Well, do you all have bags? Did you get bags when you started medical school? I got a little bag when I started medical school, and I carried it for about a week. And I decided there's no point. You know, it put my otoscope, but they were on the wall. My stethoscope, but that fit nicely in my pocket. My reflex hammer, God rest its soul, wherever it is, I have no idea where my reflex hammer is. Some doctors carry bags. They're usually the neurologists. You know, neurologists that come walking carrying their little bag and they put stuff out and they poke. But we don't ordinarily carry bags anymore. I asked one of our residents the other day about her bag, and she said, bag? What bag? Why don't we carry bags? Because what we do doesn't fit in a bag anymore. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I'm basically useless without a cardiac operating room, perfusionist, anesthesiologist, surgical nurses, surgical techs, critical care unit, pharmacist, respiratory therapist, physical therapist. It doesn't fit in a bag. So what's really interesting is if you stop and you think that our work processes are designed to what? To support my grandfather carrying his bag. And for 70 years, we had amazing benefit from that, and increasingly we've outgrown those ways of working. We have what our research team calls massively parallel individual work efforts. If you open up a chart, you can see the medical student's note says, Mr. Smith is a 56-year-old man with, chest pain, admitted for whatever. The nurse's note says, same thing, 56-year-old man, da-da-da-da-da, nursing diagnosis X. The social worker's note, 56-year-old man. Every single professional is doing this very extensive individual work. And for most patients in a hospital setting, there's maybe 15 of these different notes entered. And then people are trying to connect. Massively parallel individual work and attempting to correct. No wonder patients and families say to us, don't you people talk to each other? Of course we talk to each other. We page each other, we call each other, we see each other at the water cooler, we go down to the cafeteria together. Sometimes we're at the patient together, but not often. But we're still coming in and doing our individual work. What time do the medical students arrive to make rounds? You all third-year students, you're here what?
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock? When do the interns come? 6:15, and rounds are finally at 7:30, or if you're on a surgery service, 7 o'clock or whatever else. And what are you expected? You're expected to what? To know everything about that patient by memory. Your potassium was 3.3, we've corrected with 20 milliequivalents of potassium. The hemoglobin this morning was this, he had a temperature of 100.2, and you stand in your report, Mr. Smith is in his third postoperative day, his mitral valve, blah, 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 blah. And if you don't know that, you are shamed into being sure that you know it. I was taught this way, this hyper-vigilant way of working that is our core methodology for achieving quality in healthcare. In my residency, my general surgery residency and thoracic surgery residency was at the Mass General Hospital in Boston. And back in those days, back in the day, it was every other night for most of the 5 years. And so to make it a little more bearable, they had this little thing they called the 9:30 meal. They opened the cafeteria up at 9:30 and they fed us all. So all sorts of wisdom got passed along at that 9:30 meal. And on about my second night, my senior resident, when I was an intern, said, Paul, there's something I got to tell you. I was all ears, yes, sir. And he said, all right, I want you to, all those people out there in the hospital, yes, they're trying to kill your patient. And it's your job to keep that from happening. So that was his way of teaching me that there's basically this hypervigilance that is expected of me. And I needed to check and double check and triple check. And if something was wrong with my patient, whose fault was it? Mine. And have any of you ever, those of you who are caring for patients, have you gone home and suddenly remember that you forgot to check something that was really important? And it's just like you've been sucked in the gut, just like, oh, God. And you go running back and, thankfully it's okay, or something. Have you ever had those experiences? So the model for quality in healthcare is this intense individual effort and accountability. We're very successful at it. So if you take really, really good people, which we are, and we basically indoctrinate them into cultures where you do not make mistakes, cannot make mistakes, not permitted to make a mistake, then you get a certain level of quality, and it's quite high. You end up with a mistake about every 100th to 1,000th time that you do something, because that's about the best. 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 3 is about the best that an unaided human trying really hard, who's really bright, working in a complex environment can do. Now, when you step out of that, it's interesting. I have a colleague who, in our research team, whose husband runs the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. He's like Mr. Nuclear Weapons for the United States. He's a PhD nuclear physicist they're persistent, from MIT. And it was so interesting talking with him about safety. He said, when we design a nuclear bomb, the reactor mechanism is designed at a theoretical 10 to the minus 12th failure. 1 out of 10 with 12 zeros, that's how many times it can go wrong. If it's a non-reactor critical part of the bomb, they design at a theoretical 10 to the minus 9. In aviation, if it's a flight critical part that will crash the airplane if it doesn't work right, 10 to the minus 9. If it's a non-flight critical part, somewhere between 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 7, depending on what system this part's working in. If they put a mechanical linkage in the system, my friend's husband said that they automatically design the mechanical linkage at a 10 to the minus 3. They just figure it's going to fail that often. And if they put a human in the system, they design that flow pathway at 10 to the minus 2. They just make that assumption about us as unaided humans. Now, related to that is this idea of sigma. You've all probably heard of Six Sigma. You might even have a Six Sigma or Lean initiative going on. And so a sigma is like the little standard deviation of the bell curve. So like 1 sigma is 1 standard deviation. So that means that roughly 2/3 is in the curves, in the tails, and about 1/3 is in the middle. Meaning that if you try to do something at 1 sigma level, you get it right about 1/3 of the time, and you get it wrong about 2/3 of the time. 2 sigma moves you out to second standard deviation, and that means you get it right about 2/3 of the time and wrong about 1/3 of the time. 3, 4, 5, 6 sigma. 6 sigma, you're getting it wrong somewhere about 3 out of 1,000,000 that you get it wrong, and the rest you get it right. In manufacturing, there was a huge jump from 2 sigma to 3 sigma when Henry Ford standardized where you drilled holes in parts so that you could take a bumper off one car and put it on another car and it would fit. And with that, he was able to build his production lines. When was that? Why, that was about the same time that our systems for healthcare were getting invented. So the manufacturing processes of that time were about 2 to 3 sigma. Our healthcare processes are still roughly 2 to 3 sigma. That's about how well we do. By 1960s in manufacturing, we had reached about 4 sigma, and that was enough to get us to the moon and back. So I mean, that's pretty good. Some of you in this room, like me, are old enough to remember in the 1980s when suddenly Japan radically eclipsed our quality and were performing way better in terms of quality of cars. And they had gone to a different way of achieving quality, the Deming work and so forth that many of you know about. And they were now able to reliably achieve Six Sigma in quality of manufacturing. And rapidly we caught up, and now globally, if you want to be competitive in manufacturing, you've got to be at a Six Sigma quality level. The odds of making it home this evening on my airliner alive are at least a Six Sigma event. If I were to check my bag, the odds of my bag making it are roughly a 4 sigma event. But in healthcare, it's somewhere around 2 to 3 sigma because we're working in an old way. So in multiple ways, and this is just the tip of an iceberg because it's really interesting to even look deeper than that at our models of what health is. So have any of you in any of your classes ever asked, what is health? If you're in public health, you've asked that, and you've got a definition, and here's the World Health Organization definition and so forth. But if you're in medicine, you probably never had a conversation about that. You've been taught these are the diseases that we have to learn. Here are the organ systems. Here's what can go wrong with these diseases. And so the implicit or unspoken assumption is that health is the absence of these diseases. That somehow we're born like our glass is full, and then Mother Nature pokes a few holes in it, and it starts leaking out, and then we start kind of taking a little health and filling the pot up, and it runs out faster, and we start filling it up faster, and eventually it runs out too much and we're dead. And so the healthcare system in that model has some interesting things. If you listen, have you thought of the words that are used to describe what we do in healthcare? What are we trying to do to disease? Stamp it out. What else? Eradicate it. What else? Conquer it. You know, so what are these metaphors? Are these peace metaphors? They're war metaphors. We're at war with disease. We're in a 150-year war with disease. And so what all of us do basically is we participate in this war, which involves basically converting societal resources, 20% of GDP, into disease battle weapons. And we go to war. And that feels really good. Like, man, we have conquered, what? Tuberculosis in the United States, you know, whatever, most places. We have, no, yeah, you're right. There's still tuberculosis, absolutely. So you're right. Yeah, you're right. I agree. We no longer have polio. okay? Mostly no polio. Okay, now let's look here. We just cured heart disease. No one has heart disease anymore. Whew. We have just cured cancer. I mean, I'm projecting in the future now, and I look back here I go, yay! You know, look how far we've come. And then I look this way and I suddenly go, because what are we dying from now? I don't even know what it is, but it's something. Because the error in this way is that we all, at least so far, we all die. Nobody's made it out of here alive yet. This is a little bit just on the edge, but I got to say it anyway. I was up really late at night, about 2:30, and I've been caring for this guy with horrible lung problem with a very religious colleague who was a pulmonologist, and we were finally getting the patient settled in. And he looked up at me, and I knew him to be so devout in his faith. And he said, "Paul, have you ever stopped to think what happened to all those people that Jesus cured?" I went, "Oh, you're right, Dan. But we all die, you know, we all die." And so this idea that somehow we can eradicate diseases and finally we'll be okay. So it's like, you know, here's the curve, you know, it's like healthy, 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 not so healthy, not so healthy, dead. About the best we can do is, you know, healthy, 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 dead, you know, but it's somewhere in this little corner here is all our costs. And if we get better and better and better at converting societal resources into battle weapons, we will decimate society and we will never win because it's an infinite sink we're pouring these resources into. So somewhere that model is tied to these costs that are so high and these other things. So we're running into limits of these things. Back in my grandfather's era or my dad's era, or even the early part of my training, our limits were capability limits. We could do everything that we could do, and it wouldn't cost very much because we couldn't do very much. But now our limits are another kind that's much more ethically complex because we can do so much that we can no longer afford it. So somewhere in this deepest model of how we organize, how we practice, and even what it is that we're trying to accomplish, in order to have those problems transform away, we've got to transform the way we think and the way we work. A friend of mine has what he calls two curves. The first curve is like, so I'm a heart guy, so it's a Starling curve. You know what Starling curve looks like? You know, it kind of comes up and peaks over. So this is like the first curve, started 1893, continues on, now it's peaked off and we're over here someplace. He says, okay, we are moving toward a second curve. He draws it with a dotted line because he said we don't know what it is. But we're at this time of true paradigm shift, a once in 150-year moment of paradigm shift from an old way of working that we devoted ourselves to that was wonderful but that no longer works for us, to something else. And what's really fascinating is that how healthcare feels depends on which curve you're on. A lot of my colleagues are curve one. And if you're curve one, this is the most miserable time. You are angry, you are frustrated, everything that you have devoted your life to becoming and doing no longer works. People are not interested in it anymore. You cannot wait to retire. You're thankful the stock market maybe will let you retire again. You would never want your son or daughter to go into healthcare. But for an increasing number of us, we have done that grieving, we have moved past that sense of loss, and we are actively engaged in creating the second curve of healthcare. And when you walk into these environments, and I have this feeling I'm in one right now, your skin will practically tingle with the excitement of the birth and creation of the new. This is not something that will happen next year, or in 10 years, or even in 20 years. This is a 150-year moment, and only by an accident of when we were born do we have the privilege of participating in this. For years, there was just one way of doing things. And you came to school and you learned it and you went and did it and you made it incrementally better. But it falls to our generations to not only master the old, because we still have one foot firmly in that, but to create the new. And I can't think of a more exciting or thrilling or rewarding time. But for those of you who are students, that will be your major effort through your career, will be this creation of this new way of understanding and enacting health and care. And there's all sorts of stuff that we could speculate about what that might be looking like, but it would be only that speculation because nobody knows. You can't go any place yet and see this fully formed. But you can go a lot of places and see little glimpses and peaks of the future. And I wanted to talk really now about one of those, which is clearly this future is going to be interprofessional. It's going to involve multiple healthcare professions working together and actively involving patients and families in what they're doing. A really important part of this is going to be recognizing that culture is very much not only a determinant of these conditions and challenges that we face, but also increasingly a way of actively solving them. I'm really believing the second curve is going to be a whole lot about creating intentional, alternative, smaller microcultures or social fields where people are effortlessly able to stay in states that they really find productive and meaningful. And I think increasingly this is going to be about meaning and wholeness of lives more than it is about deficits and about diseases and treatments. That will always be important, but increasingly those components will shrink. Instead of being the whole dog, they're going to shrink down to being the tail. And the main part of the dog is going to be about some other things of our experience in life as humans. And you start realizing that a lot of the things that make people feel better and whole are sort of human connections and human exchanges, very much like what I've felt from so many of you here just in this community of your medical school and this beautiful community of El Paso. And those things actually are renewable resources if you stay within bounds. You give and you get. So you create this amazing resource just from the act of using it. And a lot of what we've been exploring is how do you begin to transform from this model to a model that works in these ways. So our context here is about diversity. And one of my research colleagues on the phone the other day said, you, a white guy in your 50s, is going to come give a talk about diversity in El Paso? Excuse me? So what I am not an expert in is Hispanic culture or many different things. But what I am an expert in is professional role cultures. And it's been really interesting to begin to step outside of my culture that I was so deeply trained in as a physician and to begin to see the richness of multiple professional cultures in healthcare and the incredible generativity when those cultures are able to interact. One thing that you might enjoy studying is the things that drive innovation. Because what we're really talking about now is innovation on a massive scale, which humans are actually very good at. We will solve these challenges of healthcare. You can bet on it. It won't happen right away, but it will happen because we will innovate. And innovation has some pretty predictable things. One of the most is that innovation rarely, and by innovation it means something that is radically new and different and has never been seen before. Innovation rarely comes out of the core of a profession or discipline. It always comes out of the intersection of professions and disciplines, where somebody sees something one way, somebody sees it another way. People are able to respectfully put those two together and suddenly 1 + 1 = 3. I am absolutely certain that our new future of healthcare is going to be born as we bring things together in new ways. And I'm going to stop in just a minute because I want to make sure that we have a little time for questions. But one of the things that was most fascinating to us as we began working, so what I've mostly done is I've worked with I've worked with care environments where people want to create really exceptional interprofessional teamwork and to really actively involve patients and families in that care. And when we first started doing this work 15 years ago, we were trying to use techniques and methods. We were trying to use things like standardizing our communication with read back and hear back and all the other things that you probably are beginning to become a little familiar with, team training, other things. And we found that they did not reliably work. Sometimes they did, but a lot of times they didn't. And so we studied again. We took a fresh look at everything through new eyes. And the most helpful thing for us was a way of thinking about things that's called social construction. Social constructionists believe that we create our realities in our interactions and our conversations with one another. And social constructionists are just full of excitement about the future because they realize all that can be when people come together in a spirit of curiosity and simply talk and reflect together about things that they might want to achieve. And what we found was that when we had built into environments, and at first it was by accident, opportunities for people to sit down across health professions in a mode of reflection, not in a mode of working on rounds, but in a mode of sitting down together on a regular basis. How are we doing as a team? How can we do even better? That those environments almost uniformly became generative, and interprofessionalism started to develop. And whoever's involved in those conversations basically is involved in shaping the reality that's created in them. What's very interesting is if you look at health professions education, if you look at the ways that it works across the world mostly, is that doctors train with other doctors. Nurses train with other nurses. Social workers train with other social workers. Now we still kind of go together into the space where we work together, but then we come back and all our reflective, formative conversations are basically with our specialty and professional peers. So if you ask, what's the likelihood of the medical students here having a reflective conversation with nursing students, social work students, pharmacy students, it's probably pretty low compared to the number of conversations that you're going to have with medical student peers and with medical student physician mentors. And so what's happened over time is these cultures have arisen. Medicine culture, nursing culture, patient culture, other cultures. And they're very strikingly different. Physician culture tends to abstract the person away and magnify the condition or the illness of the person. Nursing culture tends to look at the whole lived experience of the person and try to optimize that in various ways. These two are really, they might sound the same, but they're very different. So you get nuanced little differences. I might be called about a patient having a fever, and the first thought on my mind is, oh my God, you remember that guy? He had that sternal wound that I was worried about. He needs what? CBC, blood cultures, urinalysis, chest x-ray. I need to go see that wound and make sure it's okay. From the nurse's perspective, what's the first thing on his mind, on the nurse's mind? My patient is miserable with his fever. I need Tylenol so that the temperature will come down and then we can figure out what's going on with him. So my focus on these things feels uncaring to that nurse. The nurse's kind of little halting response to my get the blood cultures, whatever else, and then the question, well, what about Tylenol? And I'm going like, don't you see what the priority is here? And the nurse is going, don't you see what the priority is here? So all of these little nuanced differences start happening in these role cultures because these are socially constructed over time. All you've got to do is create in an environment an opportunity for safe reflection across professions, chances to interact, chances to kind of move back down this specialization curve to when we were all just ordinary people with this dream of helping somebody as a doctor, nurse, pharmacist, healthcare administrator, whatever, and reconnect at this human level. Similarly, involving patients and families, just simply moving out of those roles a little bit back down to just being people together and orienting all of our goals together. In our collaborative rounds process, where we had 8 or 9 different professions around a patient and a family having these amazingly generative conversations together, one of the earliest recognitions that this was not patient-centered care. The patient was part of this circle, not in the center of the circle. The patient was working as hard to help us as we were working to help the patient. It became truly level, and it changed everything. So there is a really fascinating journey. The richness is in the diversity. The joys of this will just fill you with a kind of human purpose that is extraordinary. It's the reason that you went into this, almost every one of you. It will be your major work. Increasingly around the world, you will find all sorts of people doing this work with you, and you will discover them and you will enjoy it. And together, we're going to make this second curve of healthcare that's going to be extraordinary. So that's my message for you today.